Now, somebody said something interesting earlier that I wanted to pick up on at this point. There was mention made of the space elevator. Anyone here know who invented the space elevator? I'll give you a hint. It's the same fellow who invented geosynchronous orbital satellites.
Arthur C. Clarke?
Exactly. It was invented by a science fiction author. In the case of the space elevator, in a book called The Fountains of Paradise, which was written, I think, in the early 70s. Check it out, it's a lovely read. Clarke in 1945 came up with the concept of geosynchronous satellites for Earth orbit. And in fact, the 22,000-mile orbit is named the Clarke orbit for that very reason. Science fiction has often been ahead of the curve in telling us what we're eventually going to do when we develop the technology to do it. It's a little bit like Da Vinci inventing the helicopter but not having the engineering capability or the materials at the time or internal combustion power to actually build the darn thing, but he understood the theory. Science fiction authors were doing something very, very similar, blazing trails long before they actually happened. This, for instance, is an early sketch from a rather interesting tale about a trip to the moon that was launched from the east coast of Florida with a 3-man crew for a 4-day lunar transit. And when they were done, they actually splashed down in the Atlantic to be picked up by the Navy. The book was translated as A Trip to the Moon and was written by Jules Verne in 1865, more than 100 years before NASA flew, in essence, the identical mission. It's not really that startling. The background of the story, because the science was the same then as it was now. The Keplerian equations did not change. What was required was the ability to actually think through the process and decide what would be needed. The background is interesting. Napoleon II, who was ruler of France at the time, had given the church power over education, politics then as now. And Verne's publisher, a great iconoclast, was just terrified of this incident and went to Verne, who had not written a novel anything like this at that point, and said it would be really great if you could write a novel that was scientifically accurate, that really laid down how something like this would happen, how it would work. Verne didn't really know, but he knew where to research. He knew how to find out. He sat down with his stockbroker brother-in-law, and they worked out the math of orbital mechanics, of speeds necessary. They got most of it right. They got one thing wildly wrong. Verne's astronauts launched from a cannon rather than a rocket. Therefore, G-forces would have certainly smushed the astronauts into guacamole on the back of the vehicle in the first moments of the craft. But you also have to bear in mind that rockets at that time weren't quite rockets yet. They were basically firecrackers, and no one really perceived them as ultimately leading towards what they would be ultimately useful for. But Verne's book was read and studied and absorbed and memorized by entire generations, including folks who would go on to design interesting systems, one of whom was Robert Goddard, sorry for the rotten picture, who was so inspired by Verne's book, among other things, that he actually dedicated his life to building a machine that would eventually be able to fly to Mars. He was also inspired by Percival Lowell and his interesting, if not entirely accurate, Mars studies of the same era, so that's why he thought Mars would make a wonderful destination. Another fellow who was inspired was a German scientist, grad student, by the name of Hermann Oberth, who was so knocked out by this that he too sat down and figured out the necessary math and wrote it up in a book, which translates as The Rocket in Interstellar Space. He was actually coming up with a means of launching rockets from Earth, and this was to be his graduate thesis. And he handed it in, and it was rejected. It was so far ahead of its time that the adjudicators, no, forget it. We're not giving you your doctorate based on this. He did not receive it. He left the university and self-published this book, which became an enormous bestseller. Interesting how science leads to science fiction, which leads back to science. Oberth was actually hired thereafter to design the technology for a movie being put together in the late 1920s by German filmmaker Fritz Lang, the fellow who had made Metropolis a couple years earlier, which would be called Woman in the Moon, Frau im Mond. And Oberth's designs involved this massive rocket which would come trundling out of its assembly building on great tracks. Boy, this is working until this very moment. Oh well. And move out towards the launch pad, where it would actually fire half immersed in water to absorb the impact and the noise that the rockets would produce. This was long before a rocket ever left the planet. And again, Oberth had come up with exactly what was going to be used in the Saturn V when it would eventually launch. Frau and Maud never actually got released, by the way. It was in the works right about when power changed in Germany and Hitler came in, and he had a very different kind of filmmaking in mind. Although if you speak to me afterwards or email me, I can actually say someone has put the 20 minutes of those great visual effects from Frau online, and you can actually see what these guys worked out. It's kind of beautiful. It just never turned into the full movie. It certainly did turn into something pretty inspiring, though. Oberth continued to work in rocketry, and one of his young acolytes, a fellow in his late teens, this is him right here, by the name of Werner von Braun, became the primary German rocket engineer. Von Braun was hired by the Army and given an enormous amount of money to develop rocketry for the German, not quite a war machine at that point. Hitler was not in power yet. And the Treaty of Versailles had declared great limits to what Germany could develop. No cannons, no tanks, but it didn't say a word about rockets. So there was kind of a loophole there. And von Braun recognized that his goal was to get into space. His goal was to go to the moon. He was quite inspired by that movie. He realized that the VFR, the small German rocketry club he was a part of, was never going to be able to finance anything like that. The German government could, so he willingly signed up. About 3 weeks afterwards, Hitler came to power and suddenly found himself working for a very different regime and building rockets which would be used for a very different purpose. The ultimate example, of course, being the V2, which I'm sure you've all heard of. It was used as a vengeance weapon towards the end of the war. It caused a great deal of damage in Europe, certainly in London. Von Braun was never terribly thrilled about that usage by all accounts. He intended that area at the front of the rocket where the one-ton warhead lived to be a space capsule. He intended it to be pressurized, and later use of that rocket actually suggested that he wasn't entirely wrong, because it was largely used that way. Von Braun, after the war, he and his men, most of them anyway, surrendered to the Americans and were tucked away in the desert in New Mexico, around White Sands, with about 100 V2 rockets in bits and pieces, which they reassembled and started to test. They were the American space program for the first several years. Animals were flown, monkeys, mice, etc., in what ultimately became pressurized capsules sitting in that area the warhead was initially supposed to live in, fired from Launch Complex 33 out of the White Sands missile range. But that was all they were allowed to do. They made it into space. They took the first shots of the curvature of the Earth. They set up 2-stage rockets based on the V2 that actually did some rather astonishing film footage. They couldn't go any further than that. As much as von Braun lobbied to launch a satellite into orbit, he felt that the vehicles he was building were capable of that. President Eisenhower did not want to get into any kind of shooting war with the Russians. He didn't want to have a fight over the high ground of space. And in fact, he and his people ordered von Braun to limit what they were capable of doing, to the extent that the upper stages of those rockets were often loaded down with cement or water to keep them from achieving orbit. It was very important that we don't achieve too much here. Von Braun, during the course of this, was building, this is the Redstone missile, which is basically a souped-up V2. You'll see very similar lines up there. You'll also notice an offset black and white pattern, which existed on every rocket von Braun ever built, all the way up to the Saturn V. There were engineering reasons for that paint job, but he also freely admitted it was an homage to Oberth and Frau and Bond, the 1928 film. The rocket in there had that same offset design. So he was sort of throwing a shout to him with every rocket he ever built.